Last year, I decided to book a weekend at a remote Airbnb cabin to get away from the city for a few days. I'd been feeling worn out and wanted nothing more than a few days of solitude in nature. The listing was simple: a small, rustic cabin nestled deep in a heavily wooded area with a cozy fireplace and a little patio overlooking the forest. The photos showed a charming, if slightly weathered place with a peaceful vibe. The host, an older man named Gary, had great reviews. He seemed like a friendly guy who stayed out of guests' way, which was exactly what I wanted. Gary messaged me the day before I was set to arrive, letting me know he'd left the key under the mat. He wouldn't be on site, but he sent a few suggestions for hiking trails and nearby scenic spots, finishing with, "Enjoy your stay, and let me know if you need anything." I appreciated the thought, but I was looking forward to being left completely alone. The drive out to the cabin took longer than I expected. The road became narrower and rougher the deeper I went into the woods. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the property. The cabin looked just like the pictures, though it felt a bit smaller in person. It was quaint, with a worn-out porch, a pair of rocking chairs, and ivy creeping up one side of the building. I grabbed my bags, found the key under the mat, and let myself in. The inside was cozy, with a little living room area, a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom that had a large window facing out into the woods. As I walked through the cabin, I noticed a few odd details. There was a toothbrush lying on the bathroom sink, a half-empty bottle of shampoo in the shower, and a pair of slippers tucked under the bed. They didn't look like they belonged to Gary, considering they were clearly feminine, a bit worn with tiny floral designs. It was strange, but I figured maybe Gary had just overlooked cleaning up after the last guest. Maybe he hadn't been back to the cabin recently. I brushed it off, deciding not to let it bother me. After I unpacked, I made myself a quick dinner and settled in by the fireplace with a book. The wind had picked up outside, causing the trees to sway and creak. Occasionally, I'd hear what sounded like soft footsteps outside, but I told myself it was just the sound of small animals moving through the underbrush. Even so, a sense of unease crept in, making it hard to focus on my book. I eventually decided to call it a night. The bed was comfortable, and despite my unease, I drifted off quickly. Sometime around midnight, though, I woke up with a start. There was a loud noise outside, unmistakably the sound of a car door slamming. I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. I heard nothing for a moment, but then came the faint crunch of footsteps approaching the cabin, slow and deliberate. They stopped right outside the front door. I held my breath, listening as the door handle turned. It was a soft, tentative rattle, as though someone was trying to test if it was locked. I stared at the ceiling, paralyzed as the footsteps moved toward the window. A soft tapping followed, fingers brushing the glass, moving from one window to the next. It was like whoever or whatever was outside was checking each entry point one by one. The sound stopped for a while, and I started to let myself believe it was over. But then, the footsteps returned, circling the cabin, brushing up against the walls, moving slower this time, almost dragging. I lay there, clutching the blankets, every nerve on edge, wondering if whoever it was would try to come inside. At some point, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, because I woke to daylight streaming through the window. I sat up, feeling groggy and disoriented, and immediately glanced around to make sure nothing had been disturbed. Everything looked the same. I got up, made a pot of coffee, and decided to explore outside to see if there were any tracks. Sure enough, there were large, muddy footprints around the cabin, circling it multiple times. They were deep, as if someone had been standing in one place for a while, watching. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it could have been Gary, or a neighbor checking up on things, even if the tracks looked fresh. I spent the day hiking and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that lingered. When I returned to the cabin later that afternoon, I immediately noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the kitchen, right on the counter, was a mug of coffee, still steaming. I hadn't made any coffee yet that day, and the mug hadn't been there when I left. The realization hit me like a punch in the stomach. Someone had been inside. I backed up, my eyes scanning the room. The cabin was small, but there were places to hide. A closet, a small pantry, even under the bed. My instinct was to grab my things and leave immediately, but a part of me was frozen, too afraid to move. I crept back to the bedroom, grabbed my bag, and slung it over my shoulder. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed the slippers under the bed were gone. I bolted for the door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. I practically ran to my car, fumbling with the keys in my panic. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the cabin. For a split second, I saw movement through the large window. A shadowy figure standing in the living room, watching me as I left. I hit the gas, speeding down the gravel road, barely glancing back. When I finally got back to cell service, I checked the Airbnb listing, determined to report what had happened. But the listing was gone, and Gary's profile had been removed. I searched online trying to find any record of him or the cabin, but there was nothing. It was as if neither had ever existed. To this day, I don't know who was in that cabin with me, or what they wanted. The memory of those footsteps and the coffee mug still haunts me, a reminder that some places and some people aren't what they seem. And now, whenever I think about booking an isolated cabin, I remember that weekend, and I can't help but wonder who else might have been waiting for me in the shadows. Last winter, I booked an Airbnb in a city I'd been wanting to visit for years. It was an older city, filled with historic buildings and winding, narrow streets. I thought it would be perfect for a few days of exploring, and I found a great deal on a little apartment just a short walk from the city center. The listing showed a 2-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a small building, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The building had definitely seen better days, but I liked the idea of staying somewhere with a bit of character. The host, Elena, had an excellent rating, with dozens of reviews raving about how cozy and clean the apartment was. Many guests mentioned how friendly and accommodating she'd been. She seemed responsive, too. She messaged me the day before I was set to arrive, welcoming me and explaining how to get into the apartment. She let me know that she kept one bedroom locked as a personal storage space, but the rest of the apartment was all mine. I arrived in the early evening after a long day of travel. The building itself had a forgotten quality, with peeling paint and an ancient elevator that rattled and groaned its way up to the top floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and I could hear muffled sounds from the other apartments as I made my way to the door. I punched in the code Elena had given me and stepped inside. The apartment was small, with a cramped entryway that led straight into a tiny kitchen. The living room was modestly furnished with mismatched furniture that looked like it had been collected from various thrift stores. A faded rug covered the creaky wooden floor, and the smell of dust and old wood hung in the air. Still, the place had a charm to it that put me at ease. There were 2 doors leading off the living room, one on the left and one on the right. The door on the left led to the bedroom I'd be using. It was sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a nightstand, and an empty closet. The right-hand door, however, was closed and locked. I remembered Elena's note about her private storage room, and though I was a bit curious, I respected her space. After unpacking, I decided to head out and get a feel for the neighborhood. It was an old part of town, with narrow streets lined with shops and cafes. I spent the next few hours wandering around, grabbing a quick dinner and soaking in the atmosphere. By the time I returned, the sun had set, and a faint drizzle was falling, giving the streets an eerie glow under the dim streetlights. As I walked back up the stairs, I noticed how silent the building had become. It was as if everyone had turned in for the night. I let myself into the apartment, locking the door behind me, and glanced toward Elena's room. For some reason, the locked door felt strangely out of place, almost like it was watching me. I tried to ignore the feeling, chalking it up to tiredness. That night, I struggled to sleep. The bed was comfortable enough, but the unfamiliar sounds of the old building kept me on edge. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to a soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was one of the neighbors, but as I listened, the sound grew louder, becoming more distinct. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the floor just outside my door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense as the footsteps stopped right outside Elena's room. There was a long silence, and then I heard a soft creak, like someone had leaned against the wall or perhaps was testing the door. The air felt heavy and an icy chill crept down my spine. I lay there listening, half expecting to hear the door open or the footsteps continue. But after a few minutes, all was quiet again. In the morning, I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing, a creak of the floorboards, a sound carried from another apartment. I spent the day exploring the city trying to shake off the eerie feeling, but when I returned to the apartment that evening, I was immediately struck by an odd smell. It was faint but unmistakable, a musty, almost mildewy odor that seemed to be coming from Elena's room. I glanced at the door, noticing for the first time that it wasn't completely closed. It was open just a crack. I could have sworn it had been locked when I'd left. I took a step closer, peering through the gap. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the faint glow from the streetlight outside. I could make out the edge of a bed with an old, faded quilt and a small table with a lamp and a picture frame on it. I felt a strange pull, a curiosity mixed with unease, urging me to push the door open and step inside. But something held me back. As I stood there, staring into the room, I noticed the faint sound of breathing, slow and steady, almost imperceptible. My heart pounded in my chest and I backed away, suddenly feeling like I'd crossed a line. I closed the door quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever or whoever might be in there. I spent the rest of the evening trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing toward Elena's room, half expecting to see the door opening again. Every creak and groan of the old building made me jump, and as the night wore on, the sense of unease only grew. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they started in the living room, slow and measured, like someone taking their time, feeling their way around the apartment. The footsteps paused outside my bedroom, and I held my breath, listening as they moved down the hall and stopped just outside Elena's door. I lay perfectly still, heart racing, as the doorknob rattled, followed by the soft sound of the door creaking open. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the silence, every nerve on edge. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I awoke to a faint light filtering through the curtains. I sat up feeling groggy and disoriented and glanced at Elena's room. The door was wide open, and the musty smell was stronger now, filling the apartment with an unpleasant, almost rotting odor. I crept down the hall, glancing inside her room. The bed was neatly made, but the quilt looked older and more worn than I'd first noticed, as if it hadn't been touched in years. On the small table by the bed, the picture frame I'd seen from the doorway caught my eye. I reached out and picked it up, feeling a chill as I saw what was inside. It was a photograph of a man standing in the very room I'd been sleeping in. He was staring directly at the camera, his face pale and expressionless, with a blankness in his eyes that sent a wave of unease through me. His clothes were old-fashioned, and there was a certain stillness about him, like he'd been caught mid-motion and frozen in time. I set the picture back down, my hands shaking, and backed out of the room, desperate to leave. I grabbed my bag, not even bothering to pack everything, and headed for the door. As I turned the doorknob, I noticed something else. A faint, worn path in the carpet leading from Elena's room to my bedroom. It was subtle but unmistakable, as if someone had walked that same route over and over, pacing back and forth, night after night. I left the apartment in a hurry, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. Once I was out of the building, I messaged Elena, asking her if anyone else had access to the apartment or if she'd been there recently. Hours later, I received a response. "I've had some strange complaints about that room. I'm sorry if it disturbed you. I'll look into it." When I checked Airbnb later, the listing was gone and Elena's profile had been removed. I searched online, but I couldn't find any record of her or the apartment. It was as if both had simply vanished. I still think about that picture, the man's empty eyes staring back at me, and I wonder who he was, or if he was even real. Something about that room felt wrong, like a place that existed outside of time, with echoes of people who had come and gone. And I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, pacing outside my door as if someone were waiting to be let back in. Not long ago, I booked a weekend stay at a small cabin in the mountains. Life had been hectic, and I was looking forward to some solitude, surrounded by trees, with no sounds but the wind and birds. The listing described the cabin as quaint and rustic, with minimal amenities, but it had a fireplace and a view of the mountains that looked breathtaking in the photos. The host, Mark, left a welcoming message with clear instructions on how to find the place, which was about an hour outside of town on a gravel road that snaked through the woods. When I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees. The cabin was even smaller than I'd expected, but it looked cozy. There was a small porch with a rocking chair, and Mark had left a note on the door, welcoming me and suggesting I write in the guest book by the fireplace. He said it was a tradition for visitors to leave a note about their stay, and that reading previous entries was a fun way to connect with past guests. I thought it sounded charming, like a little piece of community in an otherwise lonely place. Inside, the cabin was rustic but well kept. I found the guest book on the coffee table near the fireplace. I decided to make myself a cup of tea and settle in for a quiet evening. Later, as I sipped my tea, I picked up the guest book and began flipping through the pages. The first few entries were cheerful, filled with comments about the beauty of the surroundings and how peaceful the cabin was. But as I read further, the tone shifted. A couple from a few years back had mentioned hearing strange noises at night, scratching sounds they couldn't explain. They wrote it off as wildlife, though they admitted it left them a bit unsettled. Then there was an entry from a solo traveler, dated about a year ago, describing a feeling of being watched. He wrote about waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps on the porch. He even described seeing a shadow move past the window but decided not to investigate. Something about the way it moved just didn't feel right, he wrote. By now, I was feeling a bit unnerved, but I chalked it up to overactive imagination. I closed the guest book, telling myself it was just some eerie stories meant to add a thrill to the experience. I spent the rest of the evening reading by the fire, trying to push the stories out of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint noises outside, like something brushing against the cabin's walls. I told myself it was the wind, but my pulse quickened when I heard a soft tapping on the window near the front door. It was a light, deliberate tap, 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 almost like someone trying to get my attention. I stayed completely still, listening as the tapping grew louder, followed by a scraping sound that seemed to move along the outside wall. The cabin's interior was pitch black, but I could sense movement, like something or someone was circling the building. The sound stopped, but just as I started to breathe a sigh of relief, I heard a soft creak coming from the porch. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I lay in bed, my heart pounding, listening as the footsteps paused directly outside the door. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the door handle rattled as if someone was testing it. I felt a chill, realizing that whoever was out there was checking if the door was locked. The doorknob stopped moving, and the footsteps continued around to the back of the cabin, fading into the distance. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear if they would return. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When morning came, I decided to pack up and leave a day early. As I was heading out, I glanced at the guest book, tempted to write down my experience. I opened it to the last page and my blood ran cold. There, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was an entry dated just 2 days prior. It read, "He watches at night. Whatever you do, don't let him in." The ink was smudged, and the words seemed almost frantic, as if the writer had been in a hurry. I hurried to my car, heart pounding, determined to get as far from the cabin as possible. I drove down the gravel road, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the porch, watching me leave. When I finally reached cell service, I checked the listing, only to find that it had been removed. Mark's profile was still active, but the cabin was nowhere to be found on his listings. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever I had encountered wasn't something I could explain. I never heard from Mark, And to this day, I wonder if he knew about the strange things that happened there, or if he'd been waiting for someone to finally tell him.